Big question today. Can humanity even survive the collapse of civilization as a species? Can we adapt and come to thrive again after everything falls apart, or will we just end up as ragged refugees while our species goes extinct? Good questions. Now, you guys know I talk and write quite a bit about the collapse of civilization and our entire planetary ecology with it, but it should come as no surprise that I'm back at it again, okay? Everyone everywhere is talking about collapse from one angle or another, because it's the central crisis of our current existence. Even those who deny almost all of the factual reasons for collapse are still talking about it, mostly because they know it's coming, they just aren't sure how to blame somebody else for it yet. Now, at any rate, the collapse itself isn't the subject of this particular Wasteland chat. Today I want to talk about the post-collapse reality, and more importantly, whether or not humanity as a whole can even adapt to it at all. This is going to be a long and detailed discussion, so settle in for a bit. And welcome to the Wasteland, my friends. Hey everyone, this is Chris, and you are watching Wasteland by Wednesday. And today we're going to be doing kind of a deep dive into collapse, or more importantly, humans' ability to adapt to it. I realize that many prepper types and other survivalists who may be tuning in right now might not be all that interested in listening to me rattle on about scientific concepts for the next 45 minutes. And hey, if it ain't your thing, I understand. But before you click away, let me give you some quick insight into why I'm getting all deep and heavy here. Collapse prepping is, on the surface, not really too different from traditional prepping, but that's just the surface appearance. Looking deeper is how you find the many significant ways in which they differ, and that is what this channel is all about after all. Only by trying to understand the why and the how of collapse can we really get to know what it will be like and how to see the kinetic parts of it coming in advance. And so, while it might not be the most entertaining video you can watch today, something about the science of human adaptation might help you better understand exactly what it is you're preparing for. This video will lay out the scientific reasoning behind our current societal adaptations, how they can hinder our capability to change post-collapse, and how traditional preppers approach this issue much differently than collapse preppers do. The very short version is that traditional preppers are all about staying safe and alive just long enough for normal to return. That's all well and good for run-of-the-mill disasters, but not so much for civilizational collapse. Trying to get back to normal doesn't really help you adapt to new situations. It only reinforces old societal dependencies that will hinder your ability to adapt to an entirely new reality. Such adaptation is key when becoming a collapse prepper, and in this deep dive video we're going to talk about why. So let's get to it. In this little corner of the Milky Way galaxy, we have one world, one biosphere to sustain our species. That's it. Now, science fiction and grand Muskian dreams aside, we probably aren't going to spread out to the stars within the next decade or so. And since that's really all that remains of our current technological timeline, we may need to start embracing that inevitability sooner than we might like. There's two parts to that, okay? Accepting what we've done and learning to live with the consequences. And it isn't just climate change, okay? Though we've now spent a solid year higher than the red line of 1.5 degrees Celsius above baseline. That alone shows the path we're on, though I suspect our fearless leaders and the bought and paid for scientists at the IPCC will soon move the goalpost to make up for it once again. Although, to be fair, recently Drs. Peter Carter and David Suzuki, I believe, of IPCC fame, they've now both publicly come out to admit that it's too late to do anything about climate change and the collapse that follows. But even beyond that climate catastrophe, there's so much more damage being done, okay? We're wiping out plant and animal species at a rate of thousands per year. Enough biodiversity loss to actually call it the sixth mass extinction. Insect populations are crashing globally, and we just recently found out what's killing all the honeybees. It's a new virus carried by mites resistant to our best pesticides. Resistance that only exists because of our overuse of said pesticides in the first place. We're definitely losing the West Antarctic ice sheet, no matter what we do at this point, and that realization is perhaps why the media has stopped referring to the part about to break away as the Doomsday Glacier. That term was okay for the masses when it was a distant possibility, but now as a factual certainty, it might just inspire a bit too much fear. Wars have erupted and spread in the largest and most alarming fashion since World War II, and nations around the globe are entering a new arms race to get geared up for a new epic boss battle soon. Resource scarcity is starting to be recognized as much of the cause of these wars as tensions heat up regarding everything from fresh water to rare earth elements. All right, with all this happening, the world's nuclear stockpiles are concentrated almost exclusively in the hands of narcissistic sociopaths and absolute power-seeking dictators. So what could go wrong there, right? We're running out of arable land for agriculture at the same time as we're increasing our populations dramatically. We're suffocating the oceans with pollution and increased acidity, even at the same time as we scrape them dry of sea life for our dining tables. Okay, and bird flu has started claiming human victims here and there, with a human-to-human transmissible mutation now a scientific inevitability, though we have done a great PR job of getting that out of the media cycle lately. There's also over 15,000 other zoonotic pathogens expected to emerge soon to take a bite out of our collective asses before the end of the century, so we got that to look forward to as well. Which is actually kind of irrelevant because studies from institutions as venerable as MIT and the University of Melbourne suggest that global civilizational collapse is going to happen around 2040 or so anyway. And that's unavoidable, okay? By the time the end of the century arrives, there won't be anyone keeping track of any of this anymore. I'll link those studies in the description below if anyone wants to check it out. Anyway, whatever survivors that make it through the initial events will all be struggling to survive the new hellscape of the post-collapse world. And that is the real focus of this talk here today, okay? Adapting to a new life and a new future in a post-collapse, post-technology world. One of the main things that we have to understand is that what we're dealing with is a problem that doesn't have a technological solution. And by that I mean that when it comes to both collapse and adaptation to it, technology isn't going to save us, okay? Not the real tech that we have today or the imaginary tech that some are hoping will come along just in time to bail us out. The real gritty truth is that technology aside, there's simply no solution to collapse, at least in terms of preventing or mitigating it. The time for that was 50 years ago at best, and even then we would have had to change our behavior at a societal and civilizational scale. If we're honest with ourselves about human nature, we can see that that simply wasn't going to happen, okay? But there is one thing we can do, and that is to survive, okay? We never could change our behaviors at a grand scale before because that's just something that has to be done individually, all right? We're not going to be able to do it as an entire civilization or species. But we can do it at a personal level, okay? And if we change our behavior enough now, then we do have sufficient technology to save ourselves. If we don't change our behavior, even in the face of knowing that there's no magical technological fix to compensate for that behavior, then we just won't make it. Not as a civilization for sure, but possibly not even as a species. This is why collapse preppers like myself have adopted a position that we shouldn't even be talking about sustainability anymore, okay? We shouldn't be talking about the expansion of renewables or green industries or even world peace anymore. All we should be talking about from this point on, at least in terms of humanity's future, is survival and adaptation. The problem with everything else, all the sustainability and all the rest, is it's that it's just become an excuse to not change our behavior, okay? That stuff isn't truly about changing the world for the better. It's just about what kind of technological, economic, or societal fixes we can come up with that will allow us to continue to do business as usual without having to suffer the consequences for it. We really just want to have our cake and eat it too, and that just isn't how things work. It isn't just the infinite growth that we can't sustain, okay? It's the mindset and the mentality that leads for us to call for such growth on a finite planet. Simple mathematics that a Neanderthal could have understood shows us that we can't use more stuff than what exists. All right, so any changes that allow us to try to do that will just be compounding the problem further. As scientific thinkers, we're supposed to understand that all actions carry consequences. All right? We know that relying on infinite growth or uncontrolled growth is unsustainable in the long term, but that's the behavior we've seen for the entirety of recorded human history. Not only that, but it's the behavior that the vast majority of humanity wants to continue. If we look back a bit at some evolutionary history, Darwin had given us the scientifically based information to know that what we've been doing for the last few thousand years of human history, it really just wasn't going to work, okay? Not in the long run. But people didn't want to hear that, not then and not now. One of the most basic things about our nature is that we're primarily interested in ourselves right now. That's it, okay? If something doesn't affect us, we just don't care. Sure, there's a few people who take a slightly more enlightened approach to that, but they're the evolutionary equivalent of albinos, okay? They're rare and disadvantaged for their environment. No, what people wanted to hear was something that allowed them to feel better about themselves and what their future looked like. Now, eventually, a sociologist by the name of Herbert Spencer came along. He told us exactly what we wanted to hear. Okay, he did a little change up to Darwin's conclusions and he made natural selection about survival of the fittest. Okay, you've heard that term. That term became understood as being more about the survival of individuals in the present rather than the survival of the entire species far into the future. For Spencer, it was about the value of whatever is best right now. Now, this little tidbit was instrumental in changing most scientific perspectives away from evolution as a mechanism to ensure long-term survival and rather to evolution as a driver for short-term adaptation. Now, perhaps that doesn't seem very significant, and I'm also aware that few, if any, of my viewers happen to be scientists, okay? I'm not one either. But still, if you dig a little bit into how the world progressed following that enlightening bit of thought, you can see where it led. Okay, Spencer he wasn't a biologist or some other kind of natural scientist, all right? He was a sociologist. Where Darwin was an evolutionary biologist who was concerned with the evolution of different species as a whole, Spencer was a social scientist only really concerned with evolution and adaptation as it happened to societies and societal structures. Big difference. Now, eventually, Spencer's survival of the fittest doctrine, it was embraced by Darwin as well later down the road, but for now it was still Spencer's. It became the buzzword that drove us deep into the frenzy of expansion that followed the Industrial Revolution. Such an idea ingrained into our very psyche made us into the all-consuming creatures that we are today. That ideal was consistent with the notion of maximizing short-term profits economically while ignoring any long-term negatives, okay? And not just economically either. Being the fittest sent us into maximizing our chances of being reelected, maximizing the collection plate in our Sunday church, and maximizing our military strength and our industrial might and every other facet of our societal output. And everyone was quite happy with this. They still are, and they want it to continue sustainably. That's just not possible. So fast forward to our current timeline and we can see how all that's working out, which to put it mildly is not bloody well at all, okay? Not that anyone outside the lecture halls gives a damn now, but Spencer's theories weren't entirely consistent with Darwin's theories, okay? They were actually a major change in perspective, it just wasn't one that people recognized at the time. But if we go back and take a look at Darwin's original conclusions, we can find an explanation for why we're in the midst of the global polycrisis that we're in right now. With impending collapse just a few straws away from breaking the proverbial camel's back. Now, that's interesting enough from a scientific perspective, but it doesn't really help us now, okay? Learning about why we're dying isn't nearly as important as figuring out how we can avoid that fate. Still, that core Darwinism also gives us key insights into the kinds of behavioral changes that we all need to undertake individually if we hope to survive the consequences of our collective actions. All right, I know I'm getting a bit deep here, so let me simplify what the hell I'm actually talking about, okay? When we talk about surviving in a post-collapse world, I'm talking about two different things, okay? The first is the survival of our species. Homo idioticus, all right? When it comes to that, I don't really think species survival is going to be an issue, okay? Humanity in some form or another is going to survive no matter what we do, up to and including laying waste to the planet with nuclear weapons. And when it comes to that, by the way, pretty much every scenario leads to that kind of an end anyway, one way or another. And while that does mean the end of civilization and about 95% of humanity, the remaining 5% is more than what is needed to reboot the species. So I don't think extinction is really on the table for us right now. Maybe. But here's the thing that we have to ask ourselves, okay? What form will humanity take at that point? If you've seen the old 80s movie Threads, which is about a nuclear war from the viewpoint of the UK citizenry in those days, you will remember how they talked about humanity in the end. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. What the hell's wrong with you? I won't ruin it for you, but the thing we have to figure out isn't how we will survive as a species, it's what we would need to do if we wanted our current iteration of the species to survive. And by that, I mean our societally and technologically dependent species as we are, as we've changed ourselves to be now. We aren't running around the bush hunting and gathering anything anymore, and not only have we forgotten how, the vast majority of us are neither physically nor emotionally capable of such a transition. Look at it like this. If you were to snatch up a couple of typical 20-somethings, okay, say, students from the University of California in Los Angeles, all right, if you dropped them in the middle of Hong Kong or Berlin, Germany, or Rio de Janeiro with nothing but their cell phones, they're probably going to be just fine, okay? It doesn't matter. Language barriers, different currencies, documentation issues, they'll figure it all out pretty damn quick. All right, however, if you were to take them out to the middle of the Mojave Desert, just a few hours drive east of Los Angeles, and you drop them in an area with no cell service, well, then they're dead within a day or two. Okay, and that's because we've produced a lot of human beings on this planet who can't survive outside of this technologically dependent existence we've built for ourselves. And I say produced because, having kids it's more like an industrial function now than it is about families raising kids locally and naturally. We're just pumping them out to be the new wage slaves in the machine. Today, kids have screens in front of their faces before they can even walk or talk. And from the moment they master those basic functions, they're immediately being trained and conditioned to be productive members of society, rather than independent creatures apart from it. A teenager these days could book a flight, travel across the country, and purchase everything they need to manage when they arrive at a destination. But they couldn't follow a paper map to get from their own home to some other address in town. And they certainly couldn't manage outside of that town very well. If they had to make their way across a few dozen miles of wilderness, forget about it. So when the inevitable collapse of the civilized and technological world that our MIT study talks about comes to pass, how are those people going to survive? Now, a coldly rational view would just say, well, guess what? Most of them are just going to die, okay? And as shitty as that view seems to be, it ain't wrong, okay? And this is actually why the biggest dangers of something like nuclear war, it doesn't come from the direct or even indirect damage of the weapons themselves, all right? It isn't the fireballs or the fallout or even the prospect of some form of nuclear winter that will bring most of us down. It's going to be the people themselves and their inability to adapt quick enough. It's one thing to be out of shape or not used to living outdoors within nature, but it's quite another to have that issue as well as having a complete lack of knowledge and the skill needed to survive that way. That's pretty much how modern civilized humans have hindered their own adaptability for survival. Because the scary part is that it isn't just about physical ability or a lack of knowledge that causes the problem. Those shortcomings are far overshadowed by one specific thing that almost all people are held back by, and that is their mindset. All right? They're simply not mentally equipped to handle the transition from the civilized and technological worlds of society to the brutal and dangerous world of nature post-collapse. It's kind of like taking someone who has never spent any time in the military with actual combat postings and, throwing them out into a war zone, okay? Even with the right equipment and support, they're either going to panic and die, or they're going to have a nervous breakdown and die, or they're going to take some incredibly idiotic actions and, you guessed it, they're going to die. Okay, so the problem isn't just that we don't have the knowledge and skills anymore, we also don't have the experience necessary to cushion the blow to our minds once we actually find ourselves thrust permanently into a post-collapse environment. Survival of the fittest will indeed be the name of the game, and the vast majority of us, we're just not fit enough to even comprehend what that means. To top it off, there's a great many people who are societally dependent for reasons well beyond the normal ignorance and inexperience. A lot of people depend on medical technology that simply can't function without our current civilization, or even just medications that need to be manufactured and delivered to the user from all over the damn planet. Many of those medications could be created by using old tech methods, but do any of these people know how to do that? Do they have the other equipment needed or the basic ingredients? Do they know how to find and or build those things? Probably not. Okay, and due to our lifelong societal conditioning, they won't bother to figure it out now while they still can. Now those words, while they still can, those are important here when we talk about adaptation for survival and preparing for collapse. Because most of what needs to be done can still only be done effectively while society and civilization still exists. Okay, if you want to, say, learn about medicinal plants that grow in your area, well, a quick Google search will get it all ready for you. You can see the plants themselves right on your phone and probably see several good books on the subject right at the top. And you can have them ordered from Amazon with one click to arrive at your door maybe even that same damn day. After collapse, however, trying to learn such things will be incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and also dangerous. And this will be true for almost every facet of life and knowledge post-collapse. Getting food will be hard and take a lot of time and effort post-collapse, even if you do happen to be an expert in how to do it. So why not stockpile now? Why not learn the skills now? That's what preparedness is all about. So why don't people do it? Okay, why don't they stay prepared? Why is it that human beings are so susceptible to adopting behaviors that seem like a good idea at the moment, but really aren't so great in the long run? Well, a large part of the reason comes from that societal conditioning that we talked about. From the evolutionary changes we have made to our brains and neural pathways by living domesticated for so long. Okay, we've evolved for sure, but just not in a direction that's compatible with the natural world, all right? We've molded ourselves to be very fit to survive in the midst of a high-tech and interconnected world, and even the digital worlds that exist within it. But in order to do so, we kind of cut off the primal side of both our biology and our psychology. We learned how to think like people, sure, but in the process, we forgot how to think like animals, and that was a mistake. All of our eggs are now in the societal basket, so to speak, and that whole thing's about to get thrown into the fire. Now, mostly it is our mindset and subconscious mentality that keeps us from doing the things that we need to do for adjusting to post-collapse survival. There are still some of us who maintain a closer relationship with that side of ourselves. All the soldiers out there, the tribes in the Amazon and across the African plains, they know what the hell they're doing. Okay, even the criminals that roam our city's streets at least have the animal mentality and desensitization to violence and hardship to fall back on. But our regular folks, our 20-something university students, they're not so much more than meat in the days after a real societal collapse. And that's how a lot of others out there are going to look at them. Anyway, the whys behind the lack of preparedness or the drive to change are many and varied, and we can't fully explore them all here, nor is that really the topic at hand. Okay, the main thing to come away with right now is that the vast majority of people are extremely ill-suited to survival in a post-collapse environment. Okay, and they simply won't have the time or capacity to adapt well afterwards. And that is the essence of it. Okay, adaptation needs to be started now, before the collapse of civilization. Systems need to be put in place to ensure the continuance of as much societal function as possible for as long as possible, to thus, hasten the adaptation process. It's one thing to be without internet, but it is a much different thing to be permanently without the volume of information that the internet can provide. Preserving the information itself, as opposed to the medium that it resides in, that's the important part. So I'm talking about books and DVDs and everything that you can store away to look at later. Because look, it isn't as if civilization itself is inherently bad, okay? Embedded within all the dirt and shit of technologically dependent society, there are some nuggets of good stuff, okay? And even as we see that modern civilization is what essentially led to our destruction, there are elements of that existence that are worth trying to save. From science and art to culture and medicine, okay? That hard-won knowledge can help us even in a less civilized and advanced world. There's a lot of bad things that can happen without that knowledge, and for the most part, they're things that people would prefer not happen. So to ensure that, we need to start adapting now, while we can. We have to ask ourselves, what are the things we can do now that will increase our chances, increase the chances that our current technologically dependent species will survive a true civilizational collapse? And when I talk about things that we can do now, I'm not talking about the desperate hopium actions that seek to forestall the collapse, okay? Collapse is an inevitability that we all need to come to terms with as part of our adaptation. It's all happening as a result of our previous unwillingness to do anything effective with respect to climate change and human civilizational structures. But those mistakes have already been made, all right? We're gonna get those consequences no matter what. We fucked around, time to find out. But just to be clear, what I'm talking about in terms of a solution, it has nothing to do with trying to prevent collapse, okay? It has everything to do with passing through that cataclysm and coming out the other side with some semblance of what we value intact. You know, part of dealing effectively with reality is being able to clearly see what can happen. Okay, not what might happen or what could happen, but what will happen based on the evidence of past activity. All right, sure, you know, while it's conceivable that all people across the world could suddenly decide to change their behavior right now, okay, and get along perfectly with each other in total harmony with nature. And if that were to happen, hey, we might actually be able to emerge after 2050 with most of civilization intact, maybe. While these are the occurrences that most of our hopium is based on, I just don't think it's realistic. All right, it's a distant possibility, one heavily belied by the current actions of most of humanity, but it just isn't a realistic possibility. The truth of the matter, backed up completely by current geopolitical and societal actions, is that most of humanity they're going to remain fully committed to a business as usual approach, and that spells collapse in no uncertain terms. There is no other way around that. If we continue business as usual, then we collapse. That's it. Now, part of having the correct mindset for survival is sticking to reality, okay? It's all well and good to think about the way the world should be and the way society could be, but you ignore the way they actually are to your peril. So when collapse preppers like myself talk about survival, that's what we're really talking about, okay? What can we do right now to help us create a sustainable life after the collapse and before any sort of recovery is even possible? All right, that's our principal difference with traditional preppers who tend to talk about survival in terms of being able to manage things and sustain themselves just long enough until a return to normal, okay? And that's fine when we're talking about the grid going down due to some extended outage or the city being flooded and destroyed by a hurricane, but it's not so helpful when we're thinking about rebuilding life after a nuclear apocalypse, all right? In other words, traditional prepping is about getting back to normal, but collapse prepping is about building a new normal on the ruins of the old. And this is a really good example of why it's a bad idea to let traditional prepping strategies guide our post-collapse adaptation process rather than collapse prepping strategies, okay? Collapse preppers understand that conditions are not going to stay the same. Traditional preppers get things ready for temporary changes, but they stay rooted in the idea that this is the way things are, so this is the way things are always going to be. They're always looking for some sort of general law or rule that allows civilization to continue as normal in perpetuity. And collapse preppers are never under any illusions about this, okay? We understand that things are going to change as a result of our actions, and that understanding allows us to clearly see those changes coming as they take shape. And that's what it means to make the jump from traditional prepping to becoming a collapse prepper. And while that does come with some short-term societal disadvantages, in the long term, you'll be much further along the adaptation process than most others will be. But you will end up burning a lot of bridges along the way. With such an outlook on adapting for the post-collapse world, you are directly challenging all of the protectionist folks out there, okay? And they inhabit both sides of whatever political aisle you happen to be standing on. These are the people who basically want to preserve the system as it exists right now, okay? Or as it did exist at some point in some idealized past. All right, they want it to last forever without end. And even as the various sides fight against each other, they all miss the fact that they're fighting for the same end result. They want this civilization to continue, okay? And that is why the word sustainable is such a devious buzzword, okay? Finding supposedly green or renewable solutions for our problems is just another way to allow us to keep doing all this shit that got us into this mess in the first place. It's a ridiculous argument in the end. It's like trying to make a healthier cigarette, okay, or less addictive heroin. And so as opposed to allowing the system to exercise its evolutionary capacity to change in response to stress, which is what collapse represents, they want to find a way to hold on to the failed adaptations of modern civilization, which are simply not good for the species as a whole. And it sure as hell isn't good for all the other species that we have pretty much exploited into extinction, or the ones we haven't finished with yet. Everyone wants to keep kicking the can down the road, okay? Keep sucking on the societal teat. And that's why talking about prepping for collapse gets painted with such a bad brush. Lots of jokes are made about the zombie apocalypse or LARPing our way to doomsday or whatever. And, you know, it's fine. It's all part of a natural defense mechanism within our minds that tries to push away or make light of uncomfortable or scary truths, okay, so that we understand it, okay? We have a tendency to insult and belittle the things that we're afraid of or that we don't fully understand. Okay, so when we really start to explore our adaptability to an entirely new existence on this planet, it's really important for us to understand why it is that human beings in general tend to settle on behaviors that seem like a good idea, but really aren't. Okay? Almost all of our societal action for the thousands of years of recorded human history shows that same repeating error. All right? We do things because they seem like a terrific idea right then, and then we leave it up to future generations to realize, hey man, you know, maybe putting cocaine in Coca-Cola isn't such a great idea after all. There's a lot of really complex stuff at work here regarding how human brains work, and we don't need to try and get into all the dryness of that here, all right? In general, it comes down to the connection between our human ability to imagine the future while only being able to experience it in the present. There seems to be a wire crossed somewhere within our brains. Because everything that human beings have done for millions of years has been done simply because it seemed like a good idea at that time. Right? For over 99% of our history as a species, you know, that's how we looked at everything. All right? It's only been the last 100 years or so that human beings have begun thinking in new ways that allow us to see what the unanticipated long-term consequences of our actions could actually be. Such ways of thinking are actually very new for humanity as a species. Most of the time we have spent not caring farther than our next meal, okay? The problem is another part of the human psyche, which is the part that doesn't like unavoidable bad news. Now that we're capable of projecting what the consequences of our actions will be, most of us lock ourselves safely into denial so that we don't have to deal with scary ideas like collapse. So look, everything we humans have done in history seemed like a good idea at the time, okay? Maybe it solved a huge problem of some sort, and that was all we cared about in the moment. If it worked, great. And when it stopped working, well, we just tried something else. Everything we did was to make our short-term situation better. And it wasn't that we didn't care about the future, or that we somehow selfishly decided to screw over future generations to serve our current selves. We just simply never considered such things. All right, it just never entered our minds. But now we've reached the point where our ability to survive even in the short term has been compromised by those past mistakes. And we can't truly grasp the solutions to that without first coming to terms with the inevitability of those consequences and what that looks like. Okay? Because without fully seeing the future consequences, our mind will just keep us on the path of working for the short term, trying to make things better right now, trying to hold on to what we have. All right? And that isn't what we need. Right now is screwed, okay? In case you haven't noticed, all right? It was already screwed by the decisions and mistakes of people long dead for the most part. We need to recognize that the short term is now irrelevant, and that our best way to survive better in the short term is now based on how well we prepare to survive in the long term. So in short, becoming a collapse prepper means seriously addressing the fact that your short-term well-being is best served by thinking about your long-term survival. And most importantly, you will best adapt to changes coming in the long term by making the conditions in the short term look more like those distant ones. All right? As others have said, collapse now and avoid the rush. okay? What that really means is that if you want to more easily adapt to the coming post-collapse reality, you need to start cutting your dependence on societal functions right now. In scientific terms, being perfectly adapted to a specific environment, like we are for technological civilization, that implies having a very narrow toolkit with which to engage with the environment outside of that. Being optimally adapted to that one environmental reality, you are screwed the moment the environment changes. You know, what helped you excel before now acts as a hindrance. And that is how it is for an animal that mastered the marshland to suddenly find itself living in a desert. And it'll be the same for a societally optimized human to find themselves out in the cold with no society at all. The fitness for one environment doesn't translate well to another environment. The lesson here is that traditional prepping only helps us with our short-term needs, right? It's optimally suited for getting you through some of the worst possible disasters and catastrophic events, but in the long term, survival still depends on civilization going back to normal within a relatively short time. And if it doesn't, well, that's when you find yourself in a serious bind. Okay, not quite as serious as those who don't prepare at all, but you're still not well suited to a world where all your gold coins and copies of financial documents and stuff mean nothing. Those are great preps to have for an economic downturn or some wildfire that sweeps through your neighborhood or something, but they don't really do much to help you adapt to a new reality where there is no society anymore. And that's the rub. Okay, preparing to ride out a storm or other events still doesn't really change the core of who you are as a living creature. It doesn't really make you any better suited to a complete change in environment. Simply put, traditional prepping is more about learning to repair the engine of your old car and get it running again when something goes wrong. And collapse prepping is about trading the car in for some horses and learning how to ride and care for them instead. So now that brings me to the disadvantages of such things, okay? Because that's how you can actually see if something is making you better suited for a different environment, okay? Partially, it will be shown by making you less suited for your current environment. Prepping in general and collapse prepping in particular, they're actually a bit of a hamper on your current day-to-day life and activity. For example, if your prepping is really done right, it'll make you supremely invested in whatever location you're in. If you had to move, maybe for work or some other reason, you would lose almost all of what you built. Because a lot of embracing the end of civilization has to do with getting ready to live without it. That means you probably won't be doing a whole lot of transcontinental travel ever again. All right, what you'll need to do is be intimately familiar with your local region, its flora and fauna, and have it all set up to serve you in a post-collapse future. And that means you don't leave when work tells you you gotta move. You tell work, no more work. That's it. Because the post-collapse future is the one that matters, okay? Your work, your job, your credit score, your retirement plan, your 401k, whatever, all that stuff will be gone. It does not matter in the long run. Now, an example of what I mean here is my own knowledge of the desert southwestern United States, okay? I know all about surviving out here in the desert. I know what plants to eat and which ones to avoid, and I know how to find water and all sorts of other things, okay? Even more, I've spent years and years actually going out and hiking through all of this mess out here, becoming personally familiar with where things are and how to get from point A to point B on foot. Okay, I can close my eyes and visualize a map of this region. You know, to continue with that, me and my group we've set up not just a singular place to be our self-sustaining home and bug out location down the road. We've also spent years setting up this entire region just for us, okay? We have water and other supplies scattered, hidden across the entirety of the Mojave Desert. We've been doing guerrilla gardening to grow fruit trees where they'll grow and other locally suited edible plants all over the place that'll be wild post-collapse, but we know where they're at. If there's a single stack of old wooden boards or a pile of car tires anywhere out here big enough to be visible on satellite imagery, then I've visited it and cataloged what it is and where it is for possible future use. See what I've done? I've committed the sin of optimizing myself for a specific environment. But the difference is I did it in reverse, okay? And I've set myself up for the way the environment will be in the future, not as it is today. And in a nutshell, that's what collapse prep adaptation is all about. We aren't doing things to try and survive the world as it is now. We're setting ourselves up to be able to survive the world as it will become later. So now, while that will be a huge advantage in our post-collapse future, it's a major pain in the ass today, okay, for sure. Because of this investment in a chosen area, I had to do an enormous amount of work in that choice. I also had to quit the idea of working traditional jobs all the way back in 2019 because not only does a job or a career or whatever, it takes too much time away from my preparedness work, it leaves me geographically vulnerable, okay? And that's one of those societal dependencies I'm talking about. By geographically vulnerable, what I mean is that a job or career can end up dictating to you where you can and cannot live, and can either force you to relocate at some time or prevent you from doing so if you need to for another reason. Finally, a job can make you even more dependent on society, meaning that you'll need that job to keep up with bills or payments or to buy food. None of those things are good for collapse prepping. None of those things are going to help you adapt to live in a world where they don't exist, all right? And that's what I mean about how adapting yourself for collapse can make you less well adapted to societal life. You'll have to find new ways to generate income because you're not going to have time or the effort to waste on a job. It's a trade-off. And that's why the single most important aspect of becoming a collapse prepper is accepting and embracing the reality of collapse as an inevitability, okay? Let me say that again. Accepting and embracing the reality of collapse as an inevitability. You have to do the research and look at the data with a critical eye for the truth, okay? Either collapse is coming or it isn't. The future scenario is one of those two, and you have to fully commit to one in order to fully prepare for it. If you're preparing for collapse, you have to be fully committed to that collapse. You know, and in many ways, that's going to be the key to adaptation for many, okay? Either they will be ready and already partially adapted when the time comes, or they won't be. In the case of the latter, they'll have to rely on luck almost exclusively. As I said before, some people already have a leg up, okay? Specifically the traditional preppers and those others who either live on the fringes of civilized society now, or at least have some experience doing so. Okay, like my earlier military analogy, it's one thing to be able to grasp the concept and tactics of being in combat, but it's an entirely different thing to be capable or even comfortable on an active battlefield. That's how it'll be for everyone when the finality of collapse kicks in, okay? In those first few moments when you're knocked flat by an explosion or when you start taking fire from automatic weapons from somewhere, how are you going to react? You know, when you find yourself alone in the forest or the desert without food or weapons and possibly being stalked by wolves or whatever, for whom you are the food, what are you going to do then? And most importantly, when there is no civilization, and there are a few dozen other survivors all looking to you for some sort of guidance or leadership because you guys just lost an entire crop, how are you going to know what to do with that? Better to find out now. So collapse now and avoid the rush. That is the key to future adaptability in a post-collapse world. What we want to do, what we need to do as preppers is we have to work to tip the odds of survival in our favor a little bit. Okay, there's no guarantees, but what we can do is increase those odds, okay? Each of us needs to increase the odds that we're going to be one of the survivors. And we all have to know enough to be able to do that. We know enough about prepping and societal dependence to be able to alter our own behaviors in a way that'll help us separate from that society the easy way before we're forced to do it the hard way, okay? So the only questions that remains for you is, are you going to do that? All right, my friends, stay safe and stay ready. It's a wasteland out there.